Today, as we speak, 800 million people around the world do not have enough food to eat. They're living in food poverty. Just think about that. That's 110 times the population of the island of Ireland, who today have not had enough for their breakfast, will not get enough for their lunch, and will not get enough for tonight's dinner. That's 110 times the population of Ireland. But we don't have to accept that situation. Indeed, with the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals number 2, there is a drive to reduce that number from 800 million today to 0 by 2030. However, that gives us only about 14 years to achieve that. It's going to require the energy and the input from every country around the world and from us as individuals in order to reach that goal. Today, we're going to look at how satellite technologies can help in achieving this goal. Hello everybody, my name is Ned Dwyer. I'm a satellite engineer, and for many years now I've been working on how we can use satellite imagery to improve environmental monitoring and address problems such as food security. However, I've also been working with Friends of Londiani since 2009. And indeed, I've been in Londiani 3 times over the last number of years as a volunteer, and I've seen at first hand how people in that part of Kenya are struggling and working to ensure that they have enough food and enough water for their families every day, and it's not easy. So every little bit we can do to help them will help them to help themselves. So let's start at the beginning. What is hunger and why is it caused? Well, I guess most Irish people are very familiar with the idea of famine. Indeed, it's part of our cultural history. We're all aware of the famine which took place back in the 1840s and which killed many people in Ireland and caused millions to emigrate. But famines have not gone away. They're still with us in this world. However, there's also another side to the food poverty coin, and that's undernourishment, where people don't get enough food to eat, or they don't get the right kind of food to eat every day. So what causes famines and food insecurity? Well, the most dramatic cause is droughts, where the rains don't come or fail completely, and therefore the crops die, which means that there's no food for families. Another cause is conflict or war situations, where cities get blockaded, or where populations are bombarded and can't grow their crops or harvest their crops. We're very familiar with the situation in Syria at the moment, and you may have heard of the situations where Aleppo and other cities are blockaded and not enough food or any food is reaching the populations there. Also in rich countries we suffer from food poverty, and this may be due to people not having money, being homeless, or finding themselves in difficult situations, and our socio-economic system is partly to blame for this. So let's now take a look at how satellites can help us to address issues related to food poverty.
Décollage, lift-off, VS14.
This short video showed us a satellite being launched quite recently by the European Space Agency. And satellites are generally launched by rockets such as the one in the video. The satellites are then placed either in geostationary orbits at 36,000 kilometers above the equator, or in what are called low Earth orbits, much closer to the Earth. And indeed, as we speak, there's thousands and thousands of satellites orbiting our Earth. A geostationary satellite is located directly above the equator. If we were to look up to try and see it, it would be quite difficult to know it was there because it moves at exactly the same speed as the Earth rotates. Satellites such as these are used in weather forecasting, and the images we see during the weather forecast from satellites at night are from this type of satellite. Satellites are also put into what are called near-polar orbiting systems. So the satellite rotates from north to south, or south to north, depending on where you are at any particular time, and the Earth rotates beneath it. Therefore, over time, all of the Earth is imaged by the satellite system. Here in this video we can see how that works. This satellite is in a near-polar orbit, and as it rotates from north to south, the Earth itself is rotating beneath it. But here we see that it's essentially capturing a slice of the Earth as it rotates over it, passing over Britain and Ireland, and now down over Europe and into Africa. With this sort of wide scan we see in this image, the imagery we get is quite low resolution, which means that there's not a lot of detail. However, if it was a narrower strip, we'd have a lot more. Some satellites provide very detailed imagery, such as this one. This image shows part of the centre of Middleton, and highlighted are landmarks such as the Jameson Distillery, the main street, and a number of supermarkets. Many of you will be familiar with this part of the country. There are other kinds of imagery which are showing less detail, but with the data captured inside the satellite imagery, we can do very useful things. So for example, this was a project I was involved with some years ago, where we took imagery from satellites over the peninsula of Korea, and then by processing them in a computer, we were able to make maps of where the rice was growing. The Korean government found this very helpful because they were able to determine the number of acres of land under rice crops, and from that make an estimate of the harvest in that particular year, and therefore determine if they had enough food for the population. Satellite images are also very useful during natural disasters. One use is in flooding events. This shows you the result of a flooding that took place in France in February 2010. The blue areas show the flooded land. Information such as this is of great use to local rescue authorities because they can quickly see the communities affected, and it can also be helpful in finding appropriate access routes and therefore identifying the people most at need quite quickly. We can also use satellites in Kenya, and now let's take a closer look at how they can be used. This image here shows you part of East Africa. The green areas are obviously where there's more vegetation, and the brown areas are much more arid. Kenya, where Friends of Londiani operate, is a very green country, in the western part in particular. In fact, it looks quite like Ireland. People there, the staple crop is maize, as is shown in the image. Families also have gardens where they grow cabbages, potatoes, onions, and other crops that we're familiar with. Indeed, if you go to the market in Kenya, you will typically see scenes such as this: buckets of potatoes, piles of cabbages, strings of onions and tomatoes. So it's vital for the people that these crops have enough water with which to grow. Sometimes, however, the rains are less than expected, or indeed they may fail completely. In this case, the maize crop may suffer and not generate good cobs. In the worst situations, when a drought occurs, the complete maize crop fails, and in that situation, you have no food for the families. So what role do satellites play in this situation? In the image here, we see a satellite photograph that has been processed by a computer to indicate areas where the vegetation is very healthy and growing strong, and areas where it's arid and there's very little vegetation. To the north, we see the Sahara Desert, and it's very arid, as we would expect. To the west, we see a green area which is indicative of the tropical rainforest of Africa, and we see a lot of vegetation here. If we now zoom in on Kenya, we see a varied situation. To the north and east of Kenya, it's quite arid, so we see brown colours. But as we move to the south, and in particular to the west, it's quite green, indicating strong vegetation growth in those areas. This image was taken in January 2015. If we now look at the same area a few months later, in April 2015, we see that the arid and dry areas have expanded quite dramatically across the country, and only the southwestern parts and along the coastal margin is there strong vegetation growth. Later in the year, in July of that year, we see the arid area spreading much more widely across the country, and only to the extreme west do we see areas of strong vegetation growth indicated by the green colours. Later again in that year, in October, the arid areas are quite spread across the whole country with only small areas of strong vegetation growth. However, as we move into January 2016, the rains have come, the vegetation has grown again, and in particular to the south and the west we see a lot of vegetation growth. But looking at individual images on their own, it's hard to tell the whole picture. So what organisations typically do is compare the current year with the average situation over a number of years. That's what's shown here in this map. In the brown and orange areas, it indicates a situation where the amount of vegetation growth is less than normal, and in the green and blue areas, the vegetation growth is more than the normal. So, indeed, in January 2015, in Kenya, vegetation growth was a little bit above normal across most of the country. However, in July of that year, there were some areas where vegetation growth was significantly below the normal situation, and it was only to the south and west that vegetation was normal or a little above it. Using that kind of information derived from the satellite images, non-governmental organisations and governments themselves are able to derive maps which can help them in managing the food situation. So, in the period October to January of 2017, this map indicates areas of expected food insecurity across Kenya. That's shown in the yellow and in particular the orange colours, where the analysis demonstrates that there is a stress and indeed a potential crisis in some areas in regards to food security. If we look to the right, looking at the forecast for February to May of next year, we see that indeed the situation is worsening with more orange areas, indicating that crisis situations are possible. Such information is very useful because it will indicate where food is required. It may have to be provided or imported, but also it has implications in terms of the cost of food. In the areas where there may be a food crisis, the cost of food may go up, and that in itself will have implications for the families living in those regions. Satellite imagery is also very useful for tracking natural disasters. And in 2008 there was a major flood in the western part of Kenya, where over 5,000 people were marooned or had to be evacuated. In the satellite image, the green areas show you where the vegetation is growing. The blue indicates water. The river Nzoia is flowing from the east to the west in this image. However, there's a very large patch, and indeed many patches of blue, indicating that a major flooding event took place. On the ground, this was a situation. The river's burst its bank, and the water was flowing around everywhere. This shows you the entrance to a school, and that school had to be evacuated, as the students left with water up above their knees. Another situation which satellite imagery is useful is in relation to migration and refugee situations. Kenya has one of the largest refugee camps in the world, situated in Dadaab, which is near the border with Somalia. It is home to 350,000 people. The Kenyan government wishes to close that in the coming months, but it's a very difficult situation because the people there have no homes, and where are they going to go? This is a satellite image of that camp taken a few years ago, and you can see a lot of detail of where the various tents and temporary buildings are located. Such imagery is very useful again to NGOs and to the government in order to get a sense of how many people are in the camp. Imagery such as that can be processed in a computer to generate more useful information. Here we see the density of the dwellings in parts of the camp. The red areas show you where there's a very high density of people, and the yellow a smaller density. And from July 2011 to December 2011, we see a large increase in part of the camp in terms of the density of people living there. And that sort of information is very useful to agencies in order to know how much food is required and in what parts of the camp. More processing of such imagery shows the change in the dwellings over a period of time, with the red areas indicating where there's an increase in the number of dwellings and the blue areas where there are less dwellings. So in the camp itself there's a change in where the populations are, and this sort of information is invaluable in order to direct food to the right areas. I'm sure many of you are familiar with sat-nav systems which help you get from one place to another, or with Google Maps which help you to pinpoint restaurants on other locations, or you may have used a handheld GPS when you were following a trail. This is thanks to technology called GPS, where a network of satellites are rotating the Earth on a 24/7 basis, providing information that allows us to pinpoint ourselves with extreme accuracy. We have also used these when we've been in Kenya, for example in finding the specific location of water sources and pumps such as these ones here. We also use GPS devices to mark the homes where FOL were installing smokeless stoves, which helps to reduce the incidence of respiratory diseases and also accidents in that part of Kenya. We can then plot this information on maps and use those maps to make decisions. For example, here we're showing who's the head of household across a region. And in those houses where grandfathers or grandmothers are the head of household, we know we need to pay special attention because they may not be able to provide food enough for their families. So we can make sure we have targeted interventions for those. So we can conclude by saying that satellites and the engineers that design and use them are small pieces in the puzzle to help reduce global hunger. And maybe you'd like to consider a career as an engineer and do your part to help in this struggle. Thank you very much for listening. Hello everybody, Ned Dwyer here. I'd like to thank you all for the great questions that you posted me regarding the satellite systems. So I've put together a little short presentation where I hope to answer all your questions. So I hope you like it. So the first question was, how can information be brought back down from the satellites to Earth in order to be analysed? Well, this is done using a satellite data receiving station. So a big satellite dish like the one shown in the image. So as the satellites are orbiting the Earth, they're collecting information and they record that on an onboard device in some memory. Then when it passes a satellite data receiving station, and there's many of these placed in different parts of the Earth, it transmits the data down to Earth, and this can then be stored on a computer and analysed afterwards. So how many satellites are there? Well, there's more than 4,200 satellites currently orbiting the Earth. However, only about 1,400 of those are still working. The previous ones have come to the end of their life and they may have been launched 20 or 30 years ago. The majority of the satellites, as it says in the table, are used for communications purposes. Some are then used for Earth observation, some are used to try out and demonstrate new technologies. Over 100 are used for navigation and in geographical positioning systems, such as those used in cars and for navigating ships and aeroplanes and so on. And then a small number are used for space science, which means studying different parts of our universe, different planets, comets and so on. So do satellites have disadvantages? Well, they do have some. If they break down in space, they cannot be fixed. We cannot send some there to look at what went wrong. Satellites also have a limited lifetime. In general, they last for about 5 to 10 years before the solar panels or some other part of the satellite fails, and then it can no longer be used. They're also quite expensive to build and to launch on rockets. And when satellites stop working, they remain in space, and therefore they leave space debris or rubbish there. We might also think that a disadvantage is that the satellites can be used for bad reasons as well as good ones. We saw before that good reasons include the ability to map floods, to monitor crops and fires and so on, but they can also be used for things like spying or for directing bombs to targets, so this could be considered a disadvantage. However, I believe that in general the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. So what keeps the satellites in space? Well, when we launched the satellite, we put it into space at about 28,000 kilometers per hour, so that's the speed it's going. And if there was no gravity, then the satellite would keep going in a straight line because there would be no forces to stop it, so it would follow this blue line. However, there is the force of gravity because there's this exists between the satellite and the Earth. So the force of gravity tends to want to pull the satellite towards the Earth. So instead of going in a straight line, the satellite actually goes in a curved line, following the trajectory shown in the red line here. So this keeps the satellite in space. So it's the compromise between the velocity of the satellite and the force of gravity. So who pays for the satellites? In general, it's space agencies and governments. So in Europe, we have the European Space Agency, which governments from many different countries contribute to. In the United States, they have NASA, which you may have heard of. Then there's the Indian Space Agency, there's the Japanese Space Agency, there's the Nigerian Space Agency, and so on. So the money generally comes from government bodies. But there's more and more private companies which are also starting to launch satellites today. So how long do satellites stay in space after the launch? Well, in general, they can work for about 5 or 10 years, and then the solar panels or the sensors may stop working for various reasons. But the satellite itself can stay in space for many decades, and bits may fall off it over time as the forces in space are quite heavy, so it can cause the satellite to break into smaller pieces. And this causes space debris, which is a big issue. So this picture here is an artist's impression of what space around Earth looks like at the moment, with lots of different pieces of satellites still there. So how do satellites come down? Well, they don't really. As I said, they continue orbiting around the Earth. But sometimes if they slow down, then the gravity force will be too strong and it will pull them towards the Earth. However, they will burn up in the Earth's atmosphere, and only very tiny bits will actually reach the ground. So there's no chance of us being hit by a piece of the satellite. So what material is used to make the satellites? First of all, we need to know what are the challenges that the satellite is facing in space. Well, there's huge temperature differences. During the day, when it's exposed to the sun, it could be many hundreds, if not thousands of degrees Celsius, so it has to be resistant to very high temperatures. Then as the satellite flies behind the Earth, it flies into night, and it can be very cold, so many hundred degrees below zero. So it has to be able to resist low temperatures. There's also extremely strong forces, both when we're launching the satellite and when it's in space, so it has to be very strong. Then there's the chance it could be hit by space debris, so therefore again it has to be very resistant. But we also need the material to be very light in weight, because the heavier it is, the more expensive it is to launch and the more expensive it is to maintain and keep it. So Kevlar, a synthetic fibre discovered in the 1970s, it's very light and very strong, and also aluminium, which is very light, are widely used for constructing satellites. So do satellites scan the Earth for photos during the night as well as during the day? Well, like our eyes, a satellite working with the visible light cannot see anything at night. So if you've tried to, with the camera or your phone, to take a picture at the night, you've had to use a flash in order to illuminate the scene. So many satellites are in the same way, so they can't take pictures at night. However, some satellites do have sensors that can detect heat radiation or microwave radiation that's actually emitted by the Earth. And then there's another type of satellite that can bounce microwave energy from the surface of the Earth, and then this means that the reflected energy can be captured both day and night. Here's an example of the infrared radiation that's emitted by the Earth. So this picture, the colours have been produced in a computer, but basically what we're looking at is the temperature of the ocean in the Indian Ocean beside Kenya on June the 22nd, 2017. And in this image, the lower temperatures have been shown in the colour blue, and slightly higher temperatures have been shown in the greens, oranges and red. So this is just an image of the heat being emitted by the ocean surface. So can the Earth collide with satellites? No, not really, because if a satellite starts falling towards the Earth, it burns up in the atmosphere, as I said earlier. So after launch, does the rocket come back to Earth? Well, parts of the rocket may fall back into the ocean when the satellite is being launched, and we can retrieve those parts, but it can be quite tricky to use them again because they may have been damaged. Some parts of the rocket will remain in space, and as I said, the parts are not really usable again. But now people are working on rockets that can be brought safely back to Earth after they've launched the satellite. So what kind of energy is used in the satellite when it's up there? Solar panels are used to capture the light and energy from the sun, and then this energy is stored in rechargeable batteries which keep all the sensor systems going on the satellite. So this is an artist's impression of a particular satellite, and you can see that the solar panels are a very, very big part of the whole satellite. So what kind of energy is used to take the photos? Well, some of the sensors on the satellites work like a normal camera or a smartphone, and they capture the visible light reflected from the Earth. Then others have special sensors to detect infrared or microwave radiation, and I showed the example of the infrared radiation from the ocean near Kenya. And others bounce microwave energy off the surface of the Earth, and they can collect the reflected energy. But the power to operate all of these systems is provided by the rechargeable batteries connected to the solar panels. So there, I hope I've answered all the questions, and I hope that that's been helpful for you. So thank you again. Bye.